So if you're like me, you've probably noticed that guitars, particularly new guitars, have become significantly more expensive in the last few years. So what's going on? Is it really capitalist manufacturer greed? Or is there something else deeper, something much larger than the guitar market itself, which is causing this price increase? That's what we're going to talk about. So, hi everyone, welcome back to the Ministry of Guitar. My name is Utkarsh Mohan. I'm coming to you from Singapore. As always, if you like what I'm doing here, please like, subscribe, and share. It provides me with a lot of encouragement, and I also love the comments that I get on the videos as well. So please keep them coming. So, this video is of course about guitars and guitar prices, but we need to zoom out a little bit to understand truly what's going on. You know, it's very easy to get annoyed at, oh, Gibson is being so greedy, they launched that $10,000 Adam Jones or whatever it might be. But the reality is that guitar prices going up has got not that much to do with the manufacturers actually. It's the reality of what's going on is much broader. We're going to take that view. Again, if you're not very interested in geopolitics or economics, doesn't matter. I'm not going to be going down any numbers. This is not going to become something that you will not be able to understand. I'm going to just keep it to simple principles. Regardless of whether you have any interest, whether you only care about music, you'll still be able to understand this. So we'll start off with some basic economics. Again, don't worry, not too much jargon. I think most of us should know what supply and demand is. Supply is the making of goods, or the provision of services. How many guitars are getting made? Demand is how much there is a demand for such items. How many guitars do people want to buy? How much do people want to buy guitars? And pricing is usually determined by supply and demand. I think most of us know this. There are two other concepts that maybe we're not familiar with. Rather, we don't understand it entirely. The first one is that inflation, which for all of us is a very dirty word, is actually a little bit of inflation is actually desirable. So what happens is that if you don't have inflation, a little bit, I'm not talking a lot, I'm talking about under 2%, 1 to 2%. Most governments, most countries try to have 1 to 2% inflation. The reason for this is if you have deflation, which is that prices come down constantly, it can basically wreak havoc on the economy. If you think about the Great Depression that happened in the United States between 1929 and in the 1930s, that was a period where prices were depressing, everything was coming down, and it was horrible because when prices keep coming down, consumers don't buy anything because they think prices are going to keep going down, so you keep holding off. And because no one is buying anything, companies cannot survive. This is a very simplistic answer. So all I'm saying is a little bit of inflation is not a bad thing. That's the other thing to know. The third thing to know, linked to what I was talking about, is consumer spend. Consumer spend, such as buying guitars, very small part of it, but in general, buying stuff, engaging services, these are generally good things for economies. So what governments and what central banks usually try and do is they try to encourage people to spend more. This is generally the Western theory of economics. They think that more consumer spending is a good thing. You got it? Three concepts. Pricing is determined by supply and demand. A little bit of inflation under 1 to 2% is good. Otherwise, without it, economies stall. And consumer spending, a little bit of it again, not too much, not overspending, is a good thing. We got it? Now let's go back to the year that we know caused a lot of the things that we're talking about today. 2020. We all know what happened. I will not mention exactly what it is because I don't know what YouTube's policy is on this right now. So a few things happened in 2020. The first thing that happened is that for a moment there, consumer demand for everything just stopped. It just stopped. The stock market crashed a little bit, of course, but in general, everybody stopped buying stuff, everybody stopped traveling, everybody stopped doing anything. So what happened then is that when that happens, that is like a death knell to the economy. And obviously, most of the governments all over the world, they panic to an extent, right? What the hell are we going to do? And everybody has learned a lot of lessons from the 2008 financial crisis, from many financial crises earlier, 1929, which I just mentioned earlier. So the consequence of that was, let us artificially get consumers to spend more. What does that mean? They want to put more money into the economy. And I'm talking mostly the US here because that affects the rest of the world. And I can't make a comprehensive review of the whole world, but I'm just keeping it to US here. So then the US government and the US Federal Reserve decide, let's get a lot more money into the ecosystem. Because they learned from 1929 and they learned from 2008, if you don't have money, you don't have people spending, things are only going to get worse. The recession will keep getting worse. So that's where you had pandemic payouts, and that's when you had the Federal Reserve putting money into the economy. I won't get into the technicalities of how they did it. So main thing for you to know here is suddenly there's a lot more money in the economy. Now what happens because of that? You have people having a lot more time because a lot of industries, everybody has kind of shut down, and suddenly there's a lot more money in the account, and a lot of people are not doing the usual spends like travel spends, etc. So suddenly the demand, remember demand, the demand for goods, especially discretionary goods you don't necessarily need but you may want it, like guitars, suddenly goes up dramatically. We all saw this happening in the latter half of 2020. That's the one thing that happens on the demand side. That suddenly, because of the money that is getting pumped into the ecosystem for the reasons I told you earlier, and the time that people have, demand goes up dramatically. So that in isolation will affect prices, obviously. The second thing that happens is on the supply side. What happens when everything shuts down? The supply of everything goes down. You can no longer make as many guitars that you were making previously because supply chains, transportation, everything has been completely disrupted. So the supply goes down. So supply goes down, demand goes up. What does that mean? You have a lot less stuff getting made, but you have a lot more people who want the stuff. Prices explode. This is where you get the first stage of the price increase. Overall price increasing on the guitar market, both new and used. With me so far, I think hopefully I've not been too complicated. Now, what happens consequently? We are sitting in 2024. If you go to a guitar shop recently, like I did a few days ago, you can check out the video. I was just in shell shock with some of the new guitar prices. Why is it that this is sustaining into 2024? Well, few things. Once prices go up, as I told you, governments are always aspiring for a little bit of inflation. So they're never going to aspire for deflation, which is prices coming down. So once the prices have gone up, maybe they start going up slower, but they're not going to come down. So that's the first thing. Prices went up. But if you've noticed something, prices have been constantly going up. Not since 2020 they went up, but they've constantly been going up steadily, if not more than steadily, I would say, from 2021 onwards, even to 2024. So what the hell is going on? So here we get into the second thing, and I'm going to say a word called interest rate, so some of you may get bored, but please bear with me. So interest rate is basically the rate at which, and I'm going to use US as an example, it's the percentage of interest that when people are borrowing, say a bank borrows from another bank or whatever, that's the percentage, that's the interest rate that the government decides that you can borrow at. It's just set in that particular manner. That's how the government works. Now, what happens is, and we were living in a very interesting era from 2008 until 2020, is that interest rates were very, very low. Now, this has not historically been the case. Historically, interest rates have been much higher. I'm not going to get into numbers, I promise. Just know it's been very low since from 2008 till about 2020-ish, and then after 2020 also. So, but it used to be much higher. It was very high in the 70s, early 80s. Was a little bit more normal in the 90s, little bit more normal in the 2000s. But when they did and this is when I get to the point. In 2008, when the financial crisis happened, what they did to kind of stoke the economy, remember what we talked about? Increasing consumer demand, increasing spend. They lowered interest rates. Why does lowering interest rates help with consumer demand? It helps because you can borrow stuff for much cheaper. So think about it, right? If you're getting a guitar on installments, if you have to pay no interest on it versus you have to pay some interest on it, obviously no interest is much more attractive. It's less money out of the pocket. Or low interest versus high interest. So you have a choice between 1% interest or 10% interest. Very easy to understand. Lower interest rate helps with demand. This helps with companies as well. If you're starting a new business, you want to take a loan to start a new business, low interest rates help. Now, low interest rates was the normal thing. They were trying to increase it because, as I said, low interest rates is not always a good thing because it can lead to over expenditure. It can lead to people doing silly things with the money that they borrow. So in 2020, they were trying to increase it, but once the thing happened, they had to reduce it again. So they lowered the interest rates again, almost zero. So it's basically free to borrow money. And remember, more money coming into the economy, they pumped in money, which we talked about earlier, and supply chains getting gummed up. So you have the lower interest rates on top of the time that people have and the money put into the economy. Suddenly, the demand for everything just booms up dramatically. And remember, supply is not able to catch up because of the constraints. It booms so dramatically that suddenly, for the first time in 10, 15 years, especially in the US, you start having inflation higher than 1 to 2%. So remember, a little bit of inflation is a good thing. Last 10, 12 years, it's been sticking to about that 1 to 2%. Suddenly, inflation just jumps up like crazy. It jumps up like crazy because everything, all the environments are there because low interest rate, more money put into the economy. And once inflation starts increasing dramatically, it's a very difficult animal to catch. This has happened in the US before in the 1970s, late in 1970s. Some of you on this channel probably remember it. And inflation is a very psychological thing. What happens when inflation happens? People constantly keep thinking that prices are going to increase. So what happens is if you are working and you're like, oh my God, I'm living in a high inflation time, you will tell your manufacturer, sorry, not your manufacturer, your employer, I need more money, I need a higher salary. Look at things are going up, increasing so much. So the manufacturer also has no choice, the company has no choice. They have to increase salaries. And when you increase salaries, what happens? Excuse me, there's a little bit of allergies today morning. So what happens is when you increase salaries, they have to increase the prices. And so the manufacturers or the companies keep increasing prices. Companies increase prices. People think, oh my God, prices are going up. It's a virtuous cycle. So inflation, much like deflation, is also a very bad cycle. High inflation is also a very bad cycle. So that has to be nipped in the bud. Now, what has happened is that the US has been trying to nip it in the bud, which is why for last 10, 15 years, I never heard the word interest rate ever. But the last 2 years, if you follow the news, it's all about interest rates, Federal Reserve, when will they increase interest rates, when will they lower it? So the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rates. Remember what we talked about? When you lower interest rates, you increase consumer demand. When you increase interest rates, you lower consumer demand. So that should lower inflation. Again, just to explain this again, when you make it more difficult to borrow, more expensive to borrow rather, less people are likely to borrow, less people are likely to spend. And when you have less demand, because less people are spending, prices should come down. That is the theory of it. But it takes time. And we are not out of the woods yet. So what has happened for the last 3 years, because of this huge jump that we had in consumer spending and money in the economy due to the actions taken by the governments because of that event in 2020, inflation, the monster of inflation, high inflation was created. They're trying to control it, but they're not there yet. So which is why every year, every 6 months, you constantly keep seeing prices increasing. It's not only in the guitar market, you're seeing it everywhere. They keep trying, they're not there yet. They keep thinking we're getting closer and closer, but they're not there yet. That's what's happening. When will they manage to get it under control so that we're back to the normality of 1 to 2% inflation where you don't even notice it? We don't know yet. Honestly, everybody who's smarter than me in the finance world thought it would happen this year. But in the last 1 or 2 months, we've learned that we're not there yet. The data on inflation shows that inflation is still happening. So that is the reason why when you're looking at guitar prices, especially in the last few years, they constantly keep going up. And you compare it versus 2019, it's so different. And that's one of the reasons why I have mentioned this in other videos. I haven't sold my guitars yet. The reason I've not sold my guitars yet is guitars are used guitars. If you buy a used guitar, it's an inflation hedge. What does that mean? It means that the price of the guitar goes up with inflation because price of goods, price of services, salaries, everything goes up with inflation. The price of a used guitar goes up with inflation. So for me, at this particular point in time, because inflation is still not under control, I do want to have inflation hedges in my portfolio. Hedge means it's a way to protect against something. So I want something to protect me against inflation. And that's why I continue to keep a lot of my guitar collection. But once inflation comes under control, then I'll be like, okay, I'm in a place where I don't need so much inflation hedge in my portfolio. I may choose to reallocate it somewhere else. I'm not trying to give financial advice. I'm just talking about how I am approaching my guitar collection. So the point, very simply, is this. We had a very, probably once in a century like event in 2020. It wreaked havoc on the market. It created a huge surge in a huge surge in demand for the reasons I mentioned because of the government actions, huge gumming up of the supply lines. There are other implications as well, which I'll talk about in other videos because I don't want to complicate about how the guitar manufacturers were always trying to catch up to the supply and they couldn't, and now there's oversupply. There's a lot of that going on, not to confuse this video. But the main reason why guitars are getting more expensive is the events of 2020 created this monster of inflation in the way that I described to you earlier. We still don't have it under control yet. So that's why guitars are constantly getting a little bit more expensive. Well, I hope this was helpful. This was not comprehensive, but I hope you got some idea. Do let me know if you like this video. Any feedback, would love to hear from you. This is all for now. Take care.